So, thank you. Good afternoon. I'm not sure I'm enough freak to talk to this session, but I hope I will be able to entertain you at least. So, good afternoon again. I'm Andrea Bencini. I work for GAR, which is the Italian NREN, and I've been part of this community since the last 3 years. So basically, I'm not a long participant. And my participation into GÉANT activities started last year with the activity I'm going to present today. So today I'm going to talk about, the title of the presentation is Federated Authorization, which is a research activities that we have been carrying out during GÉANT 3+, last project of GÉANT, which ended April of this year. And during this activity, as I will show you, we had the opportunity to test some new approaches and new architectures for federated authorizations and federations. So the point where we started is that we were convinced that federations so far, when we began this activity, did a very good job at, let's say, creating processes to distribute responsibility for authenticating users. So with federations based on SAMLA and all the implementations that we all know, we have been able to manage effectively user identification and the provisioning of a set of attributes for the users in a decentralized and delegated way. So different organizations cooperate and build a trust to solve these kind of problems. The direction we wanted to take, so where we wanted to go, is a sort of extension to this model where we also consider the process of authorization. As we all know, authentication is one thing, authorization is another, and even if the two processes are very well intertwined, they must be described separately and also work with different paradigms and architectures. So the idea behind this research activity was to test the possibility of extending the results that we have had so far basically in authentication, but not only, to the process of authorization. The starting point where the federation were at the beginning of these activities were the one described here. So basically, identity federations at the moment try to solve the problem of authorization into, let's say, a mixed approach, a mixed between these two, let's say, representative approaches. The first one is what we called the SP-managed authorization, and this approach leaves all the responsibility to manage authorization to the SP. So after authentication, the user is created and is presented to the SP, so to the application, with a set of attributes, and then the SP has to manage the roles and the rules by which the user is entitled to access some resources. A different approach which emerged into many use cases in our federations is what we called IDP-managed authorization, where, of course, the enforcement point for authorization also in this approach is at the SP level, so very near to the application. But what we wanted to describe here is that in this case, authorization is done based on some specific attributes the user had, and the attributes was provided by the IDP. So a user accessing a service would log into to his IDP from his organization, and the IDP from the home organization will also release some specific attributes, being, for instance, affiliation or others, entitlement, that could be used for simplifying the management of authorization. The idea here, especially of the second approach, was to try to, let's say, ease the life for SPs, not having to manage all the authorization processes by themselves, so in every service differently. The approach that we try to follow is a little different because we propose to, let's say, create another entity which is a third party in respect to IDP and SP, so it can be operated even by a third organization eventually. And this other entity has the responsibility to provide additional information about users regarding their authorization attributes. So we think that the two, let's say, approaches implemented so far are very helpful for most of the use cases, but some of the use cases must be managed differently. And with this central authorization system, we plan to provide a solution for some of the cases where, are not well supported by the first two use cases. So to test this central, let's say, attribute system, authorization system, we used a Grouper, which I think you all know. Grouper is a tool developed by Internet 2. And it's a tool which aims at managing groups of users and also can specify and manage authorization attributes for users. So this seemed to be a very good tool to be used to represent authorization rules, at least at a very simple level that we're supporting our use cases. But we wanted to test Grouper in what we proposed to be as a cross and inter-organizational use, in the sense that we wanted to create groups in Grouper to which, were members coming from different organizations. And we also wanted to test how it would be possible to delegate the management of these groups to external subjects, even belonging maybe to different organizations. So we wanted to see how Grouper could best fit into the federated and distributed model that we have in identity federations. To test the possibility of using Grouper this way, what we did is that we decided to implement 3 different use cases. So we did a piloting activity. And we have chosen 3 applications which somehow are representative or interesting from the point of view of authorization. And the 3 applications that we have chosen are a wiki application, basically implemented with MediaWiki, which is an open source wiki well established at least in Italy and in many other countries. And this first use case, as we will see, is probably the more easy use case, the easiest use case that we have into this pilot, because it only requires Grouper to manage user groups for read or write access. Then we decided to test the integration of a Moodle application. Moodle is, as you probably know, a learning management system. So it's a system that is able to provide courses for students. It is very well used in our education environment in Italy. Many universities do use Moodle, and some of them also use Moodle to provide courses which are shared among different universities. So we have one single course and students and teachers coming from different universities. So it's a real cross-organizational use case. This second use case is a little more complex, as we will see, because to have a complete representation of courses inside Moodle, we also needed to implement some other interfaces to retrieve information from Grouper and groups. The last SP that we integrated, the last application that we integrated is a custom application, which I will not cover into this presentation. This custom application is an application that we developed in GAR, and it was tested into this use case also to prove and see how difficult it was, starting from a greenfield, to implement an application with an externalized authorization mechanism. So in the rest of this presentation, I will show you basically how we did the integration for MediaWiki and Moodle, and then I will try to draw some conclusion that I would like to share with you all. So talking about MediaWiki, to implement this use case, we started from the way MediaWiki works internally. MediaWiki permits to define different groups, and of course, each and every group permits to specify which specific pages or sections of the wiki can be edited or read or let's say seen, created by the users. In MediaWiki, there are 3 default groups which are always present in all the MediaWiki installations, which are that you can see here: administrators, bureaucrats, and users. But of course, it is possible to create also different groups with different names and also with specific rules of access that can be applied to users coming in. So starting from this way of managing, let's say, the authorization inside the wiki, what we did is that we, inside Grouper, we created a completely coherent schema of groups. So the screenshot here is very small, but as you can see inside the wiki section of this Moodle instance, we created groups which has the same names and so are in relation one-to-one with the groups inside MediaWiki. At this point, what we wanted to achieve is that we wanted that people can express participation to groups, so memberships inside Grouper, and they are automatically reflected to the wiki application at the first login of the user. So all the definition of group memberships are done in Grouper into this schema, and this is, one of the objectives that we wanted to achieve. So Having done that, with these proper configurations inside Grouper and inside MediaWiki, Grouper can then be operated as an attribute authority. And if you know the schema, I mean, the general schema for the user is transparent and it looks like the same as it always looked like. So a user accessing the MediaWiki, which is the SP into this diagram, will be redirected to the organizational IDP for login, as usual. And after the login, transparently, the SP will query Grouper via the AA interface to retrieve additional attributes specifying the group memberships. This will happen completely at the middleware level, so inside the configuration of the SP, either Shibboleth SP or SimpleSAML PHP SP. We tested both of them. After this operation, the user with these additional attributes can now access the wiki with the specific access rights, so belonging to the specific group he's part of, depending on the configuration of Grouper. So as you can see, this use case was probably the more simple that we tested, because all the interactions between the applications, so the SP in this case, and Grouper happens at login time. We only need online interfaces, so when a user logs in, we need to check which parts of the wiki he is able to see or edit and which not. A little different case is the case of Moodle. Moodle, in fact, apart from this, let's say, online interface at login phase, needs also some offline interfaces. In fact, Moodle needs to have a list of courses, a list of teachers, and also a list of students for each course that are provided by the platform. This because, I mean, because of the way Moodle works, it shows all the courses available and shows also which are the teachers and which are the students. So these offline interfaces Moodle needed to use these offline interfaces to retrieve this information, even if nobody was logging in at that specific time. So the AA, the attribute authority as we described, was not enough to implement this use case, and so we decided to take another direction, which was standard enough to be replicated also with different tools. To implement this, let's say, offline interface, we decided to use Voot. Voot is a protocol which has been designed for exchanging group information externally to applications or between applications, and it's an effort that has been done, I think, at the Géant level in Europe. So I mean, it's quite common and widespread. The API of Voot is very simple. It's a REST API, and so the integration to retrieve information about groups and memberships is very, very easy. So now going back to the Moodle integration, to integrate Moodle with our central authorization system, we decided to create a group for each course in Grouper, and the name of the group was the name of the course. And then we decided to manage memberships of users by differentiating them in two kinds of memberships. So we can have administrators of one group, and they will be mapped to teachers for that course. And of course, all other members, so generic members, which are not administrators, will be students of the course. This is a choice that we have made. Maybe some different use cases, or in some organizational structure, some university may not want teachers to be administrators of their group, but we wanted to prove the case here. So this is also something that we can change. So having done this definition inside Grouper, now we can integrate and see the circle closing by a specific module of Moodle, which has a modular architecture, as you probably know. So in Moodle, there is the possibility to define so-called enrollment plugins. These are standard plugins of Moodle which are able to retrieve information from external sources. So in our activity, we implemented a specific enrollment plugin to retrieve information about courses, students, and teachers from a Voot server, so from a Voot interface. So the integration schema that we realized is the one you see there. There is, and this is very standard for Moodle. There is a sort of cron job that every few minutes wakes up and engages the enrollment plugin that retrieves the information from Grouper and updates the local database of Moodle. This is a very standard implementation, and we decided to go for Voot also because if we, in the future, in real architectures, if we decide not to use Grouper but to use a different group management system, we could replace Grouper with something else, Hexa, Perun, or whatever, by keeping the same protocols. It will be integrated quite transparently. The integration for Moodle is not finished here. So apart from this, let's say, batch offline integration, we also implemented an online check of user groups at login time because, I mean, we thought that maybe the batch job should somehow compromise or break or not, may not be working. And in this case, at the first login of the user, we still cross-check if he is able to access some courses, and if not, we will remove the courses from his, let's say, study plan. So as you can see, this use case, I mean, represents another set of application in respect to Wiki, because apart from online interfaces at login time, we also need to consider some sort of batch alignment or offline alignment between the application and the group management system. So just before the conclusions, here in this page, and you will find on the presentation, you can find references to the work that we have done, because, I mean, in the first link, you can find the wiki page for the activity, research activity that I'm talking about, so you can find all the documentation about how to install Grouper, how to install Moodle, and how to integrate them, how to do the attribute authority stuff, and so on. And apart from this first link, the other three are about the software that we developed, and the software that we developed for MediaWiki, for Moodle, and also for the Voot connector of Grouper has been released as open source, and most of it has been integrated into the main releases and the main software base of the product we are talking about. So for MediaWiki, you can find the software directly into the Shibboleth authentication plugin of MediaWiki. As you can see from the link, it's in the official code base. The same for Grouper. The Voot connector is now part of the of the Grouper source base. For Moodle, this is not the case, but the source code is still open source. You can download from GitHub. It's not part of Moodle because, I mean, they're still evaluating the case if Moodle community is still evaluating if they want to integrate this into their, let's say, baseline code or not. So some conclusions. Well, what we did proved to be an effective architecture, at least this is what we think. In fact, we rolled out this architecture into 2 production environments. The first one will be is the model for accessing GM for project phase 1 activities, and Mandeep will talk about this right after me. And of course, the second, let's say, production environment where we are implementing this solution is the Italian IDEM federation. We didn't have a group management system in our federation, but we are trying to support and foster Grouper as a central instance for this scope, for this goal. And we still have some universities which are interested in testing the externalization of some authoritative attributes to our Grouper instance. Of course, we still have some problems. I mean, the activity is not done yet, completely at least, because for sure we need, in future activities, we need probably to concentrate more on some issues that we all know are still, let's say, investing AAs regarding privacy, especially. And beside that, there is a general thing that we need to solve about user enrollment inside Grouper, and I know there are a lot of tools that can help into this area, like CoManage or others. But I mean, these are things that in a real production environment, when we operate a real production service, we need to take into more consideration. So, thank you.
Do you have any questions, maybe? Well, then okay. I have one. Oh, good. Oh, okay, Niels has one, as usual.
As usual.
You have showcased a number of scenarios that, for me, represent what I would call, say, campus scenarios. Could you say something about how you could apply this to virtual organizations?
Well, in general terms, the idea that guided us is that the groups that we define in Grouper, and since Grouper has, of course, a hierarchical structure of groups that may represent also virtual organizations, and so we can use the same mechanism, also the same mechanism of delegation to manage virtual organizations inside Grouper. We haven't tested it very much because we didn't have a use case at handy, but I think this would be a good point to develop.
Now, you said that you use Voot to get the group information. Did you also have a look at other protocols like SCIM or OpenSocial as alternatives, and why did you go for Wood?
Well, very honestly, no, we didn't look to other protocols, and not because, I mean, we think that they are worse or they're not worth being using, but we wanted to leverage on the activities we were also doing in the research, let's say, ecosystem. So there was Wood available, and it didn't have any stronger application so far, so we wanted to also enforce that protocol. So that's why we decided to use this protocol specifically.
Other questions?
Hi, Andrea. I wondered if you could say a little bit about the privacy concerns. As a result of your experiments, do you have an improved sense of what those should be? What are the requirements? What would be responsive to the concerns for privacy out, from an AA?
Yeah, I can argument this. I mean, this is my, let's say, personal view, but I think that one of the biggest problems that AAs, based on SAML, still have is that, I mean, when the SP queries for additional attributes for the user, he queries asking for a specific user's attributes. But this does not imply that the SP may be cheating and asking information for other users. So this is a general problem because the SP is not managing authentication, so it's not able to, let's say, somehow be sure that he's asking for the right information. And when the AA sees a request coming from the SP, the AA is not managing authentication, and so he's answering the question without, let's say, verifying that the user requesting is rightly entitled. What I think could be a solution, but it's still in, let's say, in the air. I mean, I haven't tested it. It's some sort of delegation mechanism between IDP and AA, so that IDP delegates the possibility for SP to require some specific attributes of the specific user logging in. This is something that I have in mind, but I haven't had the opportunity to test.
This sounds a little bit like user-managed access kind of scenario. Are your ideas kind of in that?
Sorry, I didn't get your...
Something called user-managed access, a means of having a token.
Yes, something like that.
That the user could present and
the user
give
presents
to the
AA.
SP, and basically that allows the SP to just get that user's information or something.
Something like that,
Yeah,
yes.
okay. I'd like to talk more about that at some other time. You guys can go on with the program.
There was someone there. Yeah.
To sort of comment on your question, Tom, at SurfNet we picked up Andrea's work and created a service called EduTeams, which is now available through EduGain, which actually allows the team admin to pick the services that will be allowed to query the group memberships for these services. So that is sort of, again, user-managed access in a new sense, I guess. But
Yes, but I still think that the problem remains. I mean, our installation only releases attributes to groups, memberships only to this, regarding the specific service requesting. I mean, one service will not see groups for other services, but the problem still remains between users. I mean, it's quite a complicated use case, but it can be exploited, so we need to find a good solution, I think.
We still have time for further questions. Okay, well then, let's thank you again, Andrea. Okay, now before we come to the next presentation, the fact that you're in this room proves that you're all kind of access control freaks, as the session name implies. You actually can do some access control even for the next TNC by giving feedback, because as you might have heard, well, you can give feedback via the Con4Me app or on the web page, and if you think, well, Andrea was excellent, then I hope you give him 5 stars. However, if you think, well, that was terrible, I never want to see this guy again, give him 1 star, and then at TNC 2016, Andrea might have a hard time to get in. I, of course, hope that you won't do that because it would completely be unjustified, but still, there is this possibility for you to do access control on TNC. Yeah, that said, I suggest we continue to the next presentation. Now it gets a bit scary because it's about vampires, so be careful. And I would like to introduce Mandeep Saini from the Geo Association Cambridge office. So Mandeep is also working since a few years in the federated identity management area. And she has, together with a few colleagues, actually been using the results from Andrea that were just presented and built a system that is called Vampire. So don't panic. The system is called Vampires. There are no real vampires here. So that said, I give the floor to Mandeep.
Thank you, Lucas, for the introduction. And as Lucas said, today I'm going to speak regarding Vampire, not actual vampire, but the system Vampire that we worked on. And before I begin, I would like to apologize to those who were expecting me in vampire attire today. I'm really sorry to leave you disappointed, but next time I promise I shall try that. For those who do not know about GANT project, it's a European Commission funded project, and it has several iterations like GANT2, GANT3, GANT3+, and so on. And the current one is GANT4, which is a 7-year project under Horizon 2020. And this project does not only provide the physical network, but it also provides the advanced user-focused services, and they need robust and efficient solution for all aspects of identity management, be it authentication or authorization. And the people who participate in this project, they sort of form a virtual organization in a sense that they are located at multiple geographical locations, and they all need access to common services. No doubt, with the help of EduGain, we are able to address authentication issues very well, and also in heterogeneous environments such as ours. But we still lack somewhere in authorization issues. And even now, at present, we have quite a few GANT services which maintains local database to manage authorization data and group information regarding the project participants. And one of the example of such service was GANT3+ intranet. Before we had the central authorization management system, this application was using local GANT Active Directory to get the user's role and authorization data from it. And based on that, it was taking the authorization decision and showing the appropriate content to the users. This approach was working fine, no issues, but it can introduce quite a few flaws in the system because practically, if you see, it introduces quite a bit of duplication in terms of data and efforts, and also increased risk of stale data. And considering the number of services we have in GANT, and each one of them was maintaining this authorization data, the process to provision new users and also to deprovision the living users was very complex. And for the same reason, audit processes were also very complex. To mitigate those issues, we decided to implement the Central Authorization Management System. Also, in short, we call it CAMS. With the aim to centralize the authorization data, but at the same time decentralizing the management of this authorization data so that we can reduce the overhead on central IT. And with these two objectives, by keeping those two objectives in our minds, we defined some workflows for the effective people and data management. And to implement this system, we decided to use Internet 2 product grouper, which Andrea just talked about. And why we decided to use it? Because it was recommendation from GN 3+, Joint Research Activity 3, Task 1, and and the work Andrea has just presented that happened in that particular task. But group management was only one component of the central authorization management system. We also needed something to manage the VO participants. So we did a little bit more research, and we found another Internet 2 product co-manage for that. And we decided to use it for its features like VO management and support for grouper, etc. So the diagram here gives very high-level architecture of CAMs, and also how it interacts with GN services in general. So the box here in green is our central authorization management system with the components grouper and co-manage, which provision data in LDAP, and we configure attribute authority to speak with the LDAP from where the authorization data is fetched. And in order to avoid the duplication of effort in terms of discovery service and also in terms of interaction with attribute authority, we decided to use SP proxy here. Idea is that SP proxy will augment the authentication response received from the IDPs with the additional attributes for users. And together, it will send this information to GN services. And based on the information, then service will display the content to the user. Just to glance over, these are the workflows that we defined in the planning phase of CAMs. I will go in a detail for all of them in a bit, but this is just to give a little bit intro here. And to implement these workflows, mostly we have used co-manage. Actually, it would be interesting to know how many people here know about co-manage. Heather, I know you would. Okay. So we are, as I said, we are using a co-manage tool here to implement these, to automate these workflows. So the first workflow that we defined was bootstrapping central authorization management system using delegation model. And why we defined it? Because, as I said earlier, GN project has several iterations, like GN2, GN3, and so on. And it's not necessary that the project participant of each iterations are same. They could be different people, and they could be in different activities or tasks, so their group memberships can change. So at the start of each GN project iteration, we need to register all project participants' groups and authorization data into the authorization databases. So that's why we decided to define an automated process using delegation model so that the, again, overhead can be reduced on central IT. So we included features like email invitation, enabling participants self-registration, and a delegation model that fits into our environment. So the central IT invites PMO, and then PMO invites activity leaders invite staff leaders, and so on. The workflow, this particular workflow is not only useful at the start of the project, but every time we introduce a new service or organization into the system. So this sequence diagram shows the steps that are carried out when user accepts the invitation during the bootstrapping. So user receives the invitation via email. User clicks on invitation URL, then he gets redirected to Discovery Service, where he selects his identity provider, and after successfully authenticated via his identity provider, the SP proxy generates a unique internal ID for this user, which is mapped to attributes like edge person, targeted ID, and then EPPN. It's in sequence, whatever attribute we receive from the IDP. And then together, these attributes are returned to GANT camps. And here, we provision user into the central database by mapping group memberships to EPPN, and if we have, and then SP proxy generated unique user ID and co-managed generated unique user ID. Then we also defined some basic workflows for adding, removing project participants to camps. We again made sure that provisioning and deprovisioning is done via delegation model. And we also made sure that history is preserved when a project participant is deprovisioned. Also then workflow was defined to change the group membership and also to change the affiliation in case a project participant changes his or her organization but still is part of the project. We also defined workflow to take care of the situation when project participants try to access the service for the first time, but he does not exist in camps. So we specifically emphasized here on creating a positive user experience. So rather than showing this particular user access denied page, we defined an automated process for user self-registration. So we will, in this particular flow, we decided to present a web page to the project participant with pre-filled information, whatever we can get from the SAML version, and also a field to specify why they need access, and then request is sent to the group owner, and who in turn will verify and validate this information and assign user to the appropriate groups. But this will happen only in case of closed groups. For open groups, they can be added directly to that group and shown the appropriate contents. Then finally, we defined a few other workflows for revalidating project participants' data to make sure the data we have in camps is still valid, user accounts are still active. So we defined the automated process for periodic revalidation. And then we define workflow for managing exceptions, because quite a few times, like we get such requests that a user, although he is not task leader or activity leader, but he should have TL-like or AL-like permissions. So we defined this workflow to take such situations into account. And but we also made sure that we also get the correct information. So for example, if I want to get the list of TLs, it should not return me like TLs, project participants. And finally, we defined the workflow for auditing the CAMPS processes just to ensure their effectiveness and correctness at regular intervals. So now moving into a little bit more detailed architecture of CAMPS. CAMPS is a single point of contact for all our GANT services. And that's why it was mandatory for us to have high availability for this service. And that's why we decided to have master and multiple slave replication model here. And where master is used for writing the authorization data and slaves are used for reading this authorization data. And because data is written only using grouper UI and co-manage UI, so we did not have these components configured and installed in slaves. So in slaves, we only kept the components that those were required to read this authorization data. And here, co-manage makes use of Grouper web service to provision groups from co-manage to Grouper database. And then further on, Grouper PSP and co-manage LDAP provisioner is used to provision that data into LDAP. We decided to have LDAP and CAMPS just to provide some additional flexibility to the services who might want to fetch authorization data using LDAP queries. Then we configured basically Shibboleth attribute authority on slaves so that we can give services flexibility to fetch the data via FAML interface. And then services can fetch data directly via Grouper web service or via Woot connector, which Andrea just explained. And we kept both slaves behind load balancer to increase the capacity and reliability of CAMPS. We also set up monitoring for few components like MySQL replication, LDAP replication, to ensure the reliability of this service. So finally, after setting up CAMPS, here is the login sequence looks like. Again, user tries to access the protected page, and after getting authenticated successfully via IDP, FP proxy locates user's unique ID and tries to fetch additional attributes from attribute authority. And if it finds, responses sent back to the service and appropriate content is shown. But if FP proxy does not find the required attributes, then user's self-registration process is kicked in, and then user can register himself. And if they are for open groups, the response is sent back to service and data is shown. So where we are at the moment, we rolled out CAMPS in production in April 2015, and we used bootstrapping workflow to register GANT4 Phase 1 project participants. If you are participating in GANT project, you might remember that you have received those invitation emails, and you clicked on them to accept the invitation. So that was part of this bootstrapping workflow. And the first service that's making use of GANT4, that's making use of GANT CAMPS is GANT4 intranet. It's based on SharePoint 2013 platform, and in its current state, it's not using any local database, neither for authentication nor for authorization. It's all outsourced. And to do this integration, GANT4 intranet and CAMPS integration, we had to work on two components here. One is Grouper claim provider, which queries Grouper to add search capabilities to the people picker in SharePoint, so that site collection admins, they can manage site permissions using Grouper groups. And then we also used ADFS LDAP attribute store, and this provides users authorization data at login time and fits with ADFS as name suggests. But this is our intermittent solution. We are still working on implementing Grouper attribute store, and that will be our final component, and we will integrate with that in future. Here are some of the challenges and lessons learned during this whole process. What we found out, while we were looking for solutions to implement CAMPS, we couldn't find one single product that could cover all use cases out of the box. And so the other lesson that we learned was all VOs are unique in terms of their requirements. We had some different requirements than the standard ones, and for which we asked co-manage team to do some changes, and they did for us, which was great. And also, we use Grouper UI internally. Basically, it is used by only the sysadmin people, so there are only a few of them, 5, 6 of them, and we had no issue. It was easy to manage and everything. But co-managed UI was the one which we were using for end users, so they were accepting invitation using co-managed UI, and task leaders were inviting team members using that UI. So in that term, we found out that definitely UI needs improvement, and for that spherical GAO group, it was or co-managed team, they were very receptive in taking the feedback, and they are thinking of implementing those suggestions in future releases. Also, one of the important lessons learned was user training. Is important because what we did, we defined a document, we gave step-by-step instructions there, but you can't expect users to read that documentation. So in the end, we felt like user training would have been much better idea rather than the documentation if you are going to use a delegation model. And also defining groups and OU structures well in advance can help. And if you are thinking of using decentralization or delegation model, then speak to your users. Definitely, it is required. You can't expect that you will provide a delegated solution and users will be happy about it. And here are the next steps. I'm running very short on time, so I will just try to go through them. So our next steps are to integrate Giant FP proxy with the CAMs, and eventually to move all services, all Giant services behind this FP proxy so that we can make use of the central system. And automation of remaining workflows, where we are again planning to use co-manage, and then complete the grouper attribute store implementation, and also some bug and feature requests are due for next phase. And finally, I would like to take this opportunity to thank GN3+, JRA3 Task 1 team for providing their support, and also to Jean-Marie Thia from CNRF for integrating SharePoint-based application with CAMs. And finally, to Spherical GAO Group for providing their valuable consultancy support in implementing CAMs. And lastly, thank you to all of you for your attention. Thank you.
Any questions for Mandeep? Well, I know that introducing CAMs was very difficult, and you had to work very hard to make it happen on time for the start of Xeon 4. And you even stayed away several evenings from your family to make it happen. So
that was quite a bit of experience, actually.
Yeah, well, not a very pleasant one, I guess. But what was the most hardest part, the most difficult part, introducing this system?
As I said, we found the most difficult part was when users were dealing with the UI and they were not following our documentation, which was, at that point, we really felt that we should have done the training and rather than relying on the documentation, because of that, we had to do so many things again and again and just correct some errors and things. So basically, we wanted to use a delegation model so that work on us can be reduced, but in the end, we ended up doing some work.
Last chance for a question.
I think.
Yeah, there is one. Two even. Okay. Ken, please.
Do you intend to maintain an inventory of domesticated applications? We've talked in the past about as applications learn to work with co-manage. Could we keep track of which applications have been made to work that way and what the connector turned out to be? Because as a fellow co-managed user, I'd like to not reinvent that adaptation.
Yes, definitely. We will definitely have this inventory on our side. I don't know if there is some official inventory as well where we can publish our information. If it is, then we would be happy to do that.
I wasn't sure of the scale of your application and the number of users you're supporting. Are we talking hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands?
We have about 500
500?
users. At the moment, we have exactly 483 active users in camps, but we are expecting more in coming months.
Thank you. That's a very precise answer.
Ken again. Any more questions? Well then, thank you again, Nandi. So, if you weren't scared by the vampire system and are in for some more, I would like to do another commercial, this time not with Keira Knightley. There is just at 6 o'clock another event that might be of interest to you, namely the Shibboleth Consortium Update and Roadmap event. It's taking place just on the other side in room C, I think. Also, tomorrow after the keynote session, there is an even more scarier topic or session that is called Consent or Not Consent. I hope to see some of you there. And that said, I would like to introduce to you Niels van Dijk, who most of you know anyway. Niels works for SurfNet and has been very active in the federated identity management community for the last 8 years. And well, Niels is talking to you about a system called In Academia. And with that, I hand the microphone to you, Niels.
Thank you, Lucas. I will begin this presentation by stating that I will not be using the Grouper software. Not because it's not a very good product, because, sorry, we had no use case for it. If you do anything with groups, do look at Grouper. My name is Niels van Dijk. I work at SurfNet. Have been there for about 8 years, as Lucas already told you, mostly in identity management and near collaboration, enabling virtual organizations, that kind of stuff. This is actually a very different service. Interestingly, the topic of this session is called access freaks. I think it's our users that are the access freaks. They want access to stuff. And that is exactly what this service is about, access to stuff. Many services in our federation actually provide some sort of a benefit to our users. And I think many of the prominent examples are web shops, where you can buy software or a laptop or something like that with a discount. And this is provided to our students, this is provided to our employees. And technically, we have been solving this problem with our regular federations. I mean, we have, for example, the EduPerson affiliation attribute, and that is actually an excellent indication of whether a person is affiliated to an institution. However, for services, for service providers, there's actually a bit of an issue there. As you may be aware, joining a federation is actually not that simple. Might be if you're Microsoft, actually that took them quite some time, but anyway. But if you're a small player, then actually joining this federation thing is a big hurdle. You have policies, you have contracts. Our federation, for example, will happily give you at least a 40-page contract that you will need to sign. We have some statements there about liability and stuff.
Then there is the technical element here. You need to implement SAML. Implementing SAML as a product and understanding that is already a difficult thing for them. And then sort of maintaining that while you're doing federation is even more difficult for them. Well, we now have this great interfederation thing, EduGain. Actually, interfederation is even harder than doing national federation. And the biggest problem for most of them is actually that all of this is piling up to provide upfront cost. Maybe not directly in money, but definitely in the amount of time that they have to invest. Sometimes they need to hire lawyers and stuff. And they have not sold one single thing. That business case is not very good. It's a lot of work for them, but actually the only thing they would want from us is the affiliation. So maybe can we look at a model where we can make this a little bit easier for them. And actually in the rest of the presentation I will be talking about some technical stuff and some legal stuff and even some money stuff. So I'm pretty convinced that by the end of the presentation all of you have been scared and run away. So some of the examples, and most of these are actually already existing in our current federations. Generic web shops that offer stuff. One-time discounts, for example, for telecommunications providers. There was in the Géant 3 Plus project, for example, an activity where they tried to procure mobile for students. And they wanted to be bloody sure that you can only get this discount once and not be able to sell the same discount to, say, your mother, your sister, your grandfather, etc. We have in the academic environment many so-called free services, free cloud services. Microsoft, Apple, Adobe providing some of these services. But all of them operate on the idea that you're actually in academia, that you're a student or a member of the academic community. In the Netherlands, for example, we have a number of examples where you have services that are sort of in the neighborhood of the campus, like sports accommodations where you would like to rent a tennis court or something like that, or a theater which is providing, the theater in the local city, in the campus city, is providing discounts for tickets. And technically that can again, of course, be done by SAML, but typically these organizations are not really into that. And in the Netherlands, for example, this has often been sort of solved, quote unquote, by the local university saying, well, what do you know, we'll take responsibility for that. But actually, of course, this is a completely legal entity, so there is a bit of an issue there. You could imagine that several of the social platforms out there, like Mendeley and ResearchGate and LinkedIn, would actually like most of them are operating with self-asserted attributes from end users. And to be able to actually validate that the user is actually a member of the research community would significantly increase the quality of the data they have. And then we have a use case where where several researchy type services, like for example ORCID, would actually like to have a lightweight validation service as well. Again, these operate on self-asserted data, and the additional validation of the academic affiliation would be helpful there. So what kind of things could we tweak to make this easier? Well, let's begin with assuming that all the data that goes to such a service from the user is actually mostly self-asserted, sorry. And well, if I buy a laptop, I will make sure that my address is okay, because otherwise nobody will send me the laptop. So there's no real use case for the institution to be involved in this kind of data exchange. But of course, the affiliation is the only thing where the institution must be involved, because that's the only authoritative source out there. The student or the employee themselves can never be authoritative for the affiliation. We currently have a situation where this service would have to talk to many IDPs, either on a national level or on an international level. So what if we create a single centralized service that would allow the service provider to affiliate validation? That would really reduce his N-to-M amount of endpoints to a 1-to-N scenario, which is in general more cost effective. We actually have a very good means of validating the affiliation? We have our federations. So can we in some clever way use the existing federation infrastructure that we have to aid this process? Maybe we should not do SAML because, well, I named a few of the problems with SAML before. We know that SAML is very secure. That's a good thing. We may want to keep that. But there are some additional new protocols out there, and the one we're using here is OpenID Connect, which can provide the same level of security, but the implementation path for the protocol itself is way easier than SAML. And there's another thing. A lot of big parties out there, the Googles and the Facebooks, are already doing OpenID Connect. And that makes it actually, for somebody implementing this kind of connection in their service, it makes it way more familiar territory, if you understand what I mean. Well, many federations have policies. Maybe we should look at the policy barrier as well. Do we really need all this policy stuff for only giving them the affiliation attribute? Maybe we can do there something as well. And then finally, and that is maybe as interesting as all the other ones, actually it's a bit of a weird situation. We have identity federations where in most scenarios, in most countries, the IDPs are paying for the federation. Well, that makes good sense if you're sort of outsourcing your blackboards, because there is benefit for the IDP to actually do that, for the institution to do that. But why should the institution pay for the fact that the student is going to get a 20% discount on the laptop? That's actually a bit weird. And it's actually also a bit detrimental to the whole cost model for the federation, because if you want to do this kind of validations on a high scale, then actually you would end up in a scenario where the institutions start paying for a whole lot of stuff that's actually not really relevant to their core business. So maybe we should have the services pay a small transaction fee. Sorry. So to allow for all of this, we've created a service called the In Academia Simple Validation Service. And basically, this is being operated as a hub or a proxy or a single spoke, whatever you want to call it. On the far end over there, it's basically behaving like what we would recognize as a normal EduGain service provider. It allows EduGain IDPs, so basically our institutions, to connect to this service. You need to do some discovery, etc. But this is pretty regular stuff, actually. We do this all the time. On the other end, on this end of the service, this is actually an OpenID Connect service. The service itself, the proxy, is providing an interface which is called the OpenID Connect OpenID Provider. You can forget that name, but for sanity's sake, I've chosen to do the SAML names on that end and the OpenID Connect names on this end, because some wise folks decided that although the functional things are exactly the same, we should name them differently. And a service is called a relying party. So OpenID Connect on one end, SAML, EduGain on one end, and some intelligence in between. And actually the intelligence, the In Academia core, is basically a filter where it is receiving the request from the service. The service will then, the In Academia service will then pick up that request, provide the end user with the question, okay, log in at the In Academia service so I can actually validate that you have an academic affiliation, and use the EduGain, the regular EduGain Federation path to do that. Well, of course, we have some registration components there as well. Not really interesting for now, I think. On the OpenID Connect side, so on the side of the services, and that was sort of a general statement for the whole project that we wanted to do, is we wanted to deal with privacy-sensitive data. We had to, and we wanted to do it in a privacy-sensitive way. So in the design of the service, we took as much care as we could to make sure that we are doing this well, as nice and as technically sane as possible. An OpenID Connect service, an RP, can ask for only a specific question. So it can only ask for, is this user affiliated? It cannot ask for, give me all the affiliations for this user. It can only ask, is this an affiliated user? and we can only answer basically, roughly said, yes or no. So we can only give a Boolean answer back. And here you can see the scopes that you can actually ask. You can ask, is this person affiliated? In that case, you cannot even get to know as the service whether this affiliation is student or employee, or simply getting the fact that he is affiliated. You can ask for an employee affiliation, for a student affiliation, or an alumnus affiliation. But in configuration, we define what you may actually ask. So a service cannot ask everything, it can only ask specific things. We support two profiles, a persistent profile and a transient profile, whereas the transient profile will behave like you are probably familiar with in SAML as well. It means actually that there's no way that the service can then build a profile on the information that we are providing, whereas when we're using a persistent profile, the service actually gets an identifier that can be used to build a profile. And the latter is especially useful for this scenario where they want only to provide a one-time discount. In addition, because this is a service that we want to roll out towards EduGain and at least pan-European, we wanted to provide some additional information to the service on country and on the domain. And this is optional information that can be requested and may not be delivered by the home organization. So on the SAML side of things, we're actually requesting some pretty normal things, I would say. A transient SAML name ID for the transient profile, an EduPerson affiliation, well, that is sort of, you could have guessed that we needed that one. And optionally, a check home organization. And for the persistent name ID, for the persistent profile, we request the persistent name ID, the EduPerson affiliation again, and again, optionally, the check home organization. The country claim that we can provide as a service is actually calculated from the IDP because we know in which country the IDP is registered, so we can do that on the fly. So the technical design considerations we had is that we wanted to be able to scale this service globally from day one. So no simple achievements there. We wanted to minimize personal data handling as much as possible, and given local laws, we wanted to be able to make sure that if we can keep data within the EU, because you are talking to an EU service from an EU IDP, then there is no real reason to go outside. Of course, if you have a service that is in the US, well, there's little can be done. So we actually wanted to have some sort of zoning for the data. So what we actually built, and it's already there, is one service from a functional perspective, but actually it implements a number of geographically distributed nodes. We currently have 8 nodes in the Netherlands, in Denmark, and in Greece. We're using GeoDNS as a technology to make sure that we can handle transactions within the zones. We're providing 2 SAML attribute profiles, the persistent and the transient one. OpenID Connect is available for the services to connect to us. And we're completely stateless. We're not storing any personal data about the transaction. Also, for example, not consent, nothing. We do need to log a little bit of data. I will talk about that a little bit later. And we only store that data on the local nodes. So even if, say, the Danish local law enforcement would want to know something about the data handled in the Dutch node, we cannot give them because, well, they would at least need a federal order or something like that. And the service will allow all EduGain IDPs in by default. So, moving from the technical considerations to the legal considerations, it's clear that the in-academia service is dealing with personal data. Also, the in-academia service wanted to support the EduGain Code of Conduct from day one on the SAML side of things. So one of the things we do is and we wanted to minimize the amount of personal data we deal with. So we are asking pseudonymous IDs and the affiliation. So actually already the in-academia service itself does not really know who this person is. We will then send on the pseudonymous identifier in the case of the persistent scenario to the service, but we redo the actual identifier. So you cannot link anything between the SAML world and the OpenID Connect world. As I said, all transactions are completely atomic, so we don't store any data. We ask for consent always, and we don't do any SSO between sessions. we do need to store the consent logging. That's a requirement coming from the Educane Code of Conduct. But when we do that, we store that as a SHA-512 hash. So actually, the only way we can sort of tell you whether consent was given is if you tell us exactly which person, which service, and which IDP. That's the only way I can then calculate whether we had consent. The other thing is we do track transaction data because we want to know which service is receiving, how many transactions a service is receiving. But we immediately and instantly aggregate that data to a level where that's no longer personal data either. So in academia it's actually proxying, but proxying on behalf of whom? That's the interesting question from a legal standpoint. Basically, and this is now the area where we have not made all the decisions for the service, we could deploy, broadly said, 2 scenarios. First of all, an in-academia broker, where actually the in-academia service itself would engage in contracts with services directly and actually without any involvement of the home institution. The in-academia service would then be a service. It would be living up to Educane Code of Conduct. You can sort of see the contractual flows on the top end of the schema and the validation flow in red on the lower end of the schema. We would require consent, but there is a number of problems with this scenario. Because even if in academia would support Educane, the in-academia service itself would have to have some legal ground for processing the data that would come from the institutions. Typically, the institutions have collected this data to do educational stuff. That's their mandate, and that's why they get your personal data if you're a student. In academia, it's not doing education. Another thing is that consent, good session tomorrow, by the way, must be given freely at all times. Only then the in-academia service can live up to its legal responsibilities. But that cannot be guaranteed for all services. You could very well imagine the in-academia service being used for a service that is actually a must for the user to use. Say, for example, to buy a specific piece of software that he needs to do his next course. In that case, consent would not work. And also, if the service would be in the US, consent is needed, but what if this is again a piece of software that is needed? There's a problem there. So the only real scenario that would work there is to have a real two-party contract between the home institution and the in-academia service. However, given that we have about 2,500 IDPs in Educane, that's going to be an interesting process. So it is likely that we have another scenario number 2, where in-academia is the gateway. It's likely that this scenario is going to work better, but it has some pros and cons as well. In the second scenario, where in-academia is the gateway, it is actually only the technical facilitator for the transfer. The home institution has already some contract with the actual service provider, and that can either be done by the identity provider itself, by the home institution itself. It could have been agreed upon by the NREN. Maybe the NREN has a procurement organization. You could imagine the GEANT organization buying and enabling services and entering a procurement, or perhaps even a commercial company doing that on behalf of the institution. But anyway, the contract is already there. Then again, the in-academia service lives up to the Educane COCO, but now as there is an actual contract between the institution and the service, from a legal perspective, the in-academia is just a technical relay acting on behalf of the institution, and that really significantly makes it less troublesome. Well, the contract between the home institution and the service should at least contain the clauses from the Educane Code of Conduct. And of course, this is sort of partly outsourcing the contract flow. So this definitely means that the service provider for in-academia should do additional stuff to support the procurement organizations and the home institutions, but also the services way more to make sure that you can make this connection easier. An interesting thing that is left in this scenario is what you should actually do with home organizations in regard to opt-in or opt-out. You could imagine a scenario where, say, Géant would be procuring services, but not all institutions want to use all services that have been procured. Well, there are some technical solutions for that, there are some policy solutions for that, and we're looking into that right now. Cost and benefit. The platform itself is actually pretty nimble, and we have built in all the characteristics that makes us assume that we will be able to scale this very well. So the support costs for the platform should not be too high. We also expect that if we can route most of the support through the NRENs and the federations, that we can comfortably deal with that. So overall, we expect this to be a pretty low-cost service. As a benefit, well, as I said earlier, as this service is not really benefiting the institution directly, it should at least be made self-sustainable so that it is not putting additional costs on top of the already stressed budgets of the institutions. One way of doing this would be to introduce a freemium pay-per-use model, where you can sort of imagine that if you're a service where you have only very low transactions, like what could typically be for, say, the theater or the sports accommodations, then actually the amount of money you would have to pay would be low, maybe even zero. Whereas if you're Microsoft and you're selling Office 365 via this platform, well, it seems fair that you might need to pay some extra money there. What is clear is that we will need some support from the NRENs and the Géant project for a few years to make sure that we can sustain the freemium version of this platform, but also to make sure that we can allow the in-academia project to sort of reach maturity and make sure that it can actually sustain itself into the future. So, as a recap, if you're an identity provider or an NREN, and you would like to use the in-academia service, well, good news. You can use your existing SAML infrastructure. It's basically a normal service provider for you. It's using EduGain. We're all there already, or mostly. So get there and connect. We have two profiles that you can choose between. The attribute release requirements are really minimal, so that should not be a real problem. We make sure that we are not storing personal data in the centralized service, so that should not be a worry. And we make sure that your one connection to the in-academia service will provide you with a wealth of potentially interesting services for your users. So you're going to make your users very happy. And we will create a pricing model which actually creates a revenue stream that at least should sustain the in-academia service itself. So it's also not going to cost you anything. Well, welcome to paradise. If you're a service provider, or an RP as it's technically called, we are providing you with an OpenID Connect interface. So you don't need to do SAML and all the stuff that comes with it. The fact that you have only one party to deal with, the in-academia service, will make your life significantly easier. We're trying to work towards a simplified policy, and at least this policy will be compatible with the EduGain Code of Conduct. We want to introduce the pricing model with this freemium model, where it's actually really easy to begin on a small scale, and then as soon as you start making your business as a service and you become successful, only then you will have to pay more for using the service. Well, and as I said, the service will provide you with one connection to many of the trusted identity providers. There's a really interesting blinky thing there. Is your tablet broken, Lucas? I'm almost done. The team that made this possible, and I would definitely want to highlight them because they have done a really great job. This project only started September last year, so basically we're only at it for 9 months. Well, we all know that interesting things happen in 9 months. This project started out as a research activity in the JRA, in the Géant 3 Plus JRA 3T1 project. We always like these long names. Well, anyway, we now have continued this project in Géant 4 in a SA5 activity, which is actually an activity that wants to push stuff to real production services. We had an excellent team, an excellent development team coming from Umea University, headed by Roland, but also thanks to Daniel and to Rebecca. The infrastructure was done by me and by Leif. Some of you may know him. The legal advice was done by Michael and by Evelijn. Remco and I did most of the documentation, and I had the honor of actually running this project. And I want to thank several others of you, including many of the people from other essay projects who have provided input, feedback, and consultation there. I'm not going to talk about this slide, I will leave it there. But this is the planning for the upcoming time. We should have this service up and running by the end of year 1 of the GEAN project. So if there's any questions, I would be happy to take them.
Well, Niels bribed me by bringing me a glass of water, and I promised him in return not to ask any nasty questions. However, as usually Niels asks this kind of question, I'm sure there are some people in the audience who would like to return that favor. I see there are. Okay, so let's start first with David.
A simple question, how much will a transaction cost?
Yeah, that's a good question. And actually, I don't know.
Thank you.
But, no,
How much
but
you got, David? What do you?
I've got loads.
I mean, what's a reasonable price?
Yeah, that's my question.
Well, I'm asking you now. What's a reasonable price?
Okay, a euro cent.
I didn't catch what you were saying.
A euro cent. He says a
1
euro
euro
cent.
cent. Well, I must admit that although we haven't sort of set this, we are indeed thinking about really low transaction fees, where actually the transaction fee would not put any real burden on the actual total price of what you're getting there. So indeed, say 10 cents, 50 cents, something like that. It's really a numbers game here. What you want here is 100 million transactions, so that even if you're only asking for 10 cents, you would still be fairly okay in sustaining the service.
Thank you for this wonderful presentation and project. This business model is, of course, very interesting. I'm asking myself, why did, because, I mean, one thing is to get this cheap answer of affiliation. The other thing is to get all the answers normal XAML service providers get from IDPs. Why don't they get charged for getting this? This is a very interesting business model.
Well, I think way back when we had a lot of good ideas about how to do federation, but actually had no services, many federations were scared to actually impose money on transactions or on whatever, basically, because that provides an additional hurdle. And there are already hurdles enough. So I think that was the reasoning for many federations. Also, another reasoning was that in many cases, the IDPs can actually, so the institutions actually benefit from the fact that they can, for example, outsource their Blackboard because they are reducing cost. So there is some, well, there is some credit to that reasoning. But as I'm trying to propose here, I don't think there is that is always the case. So maybe we should introduce an additional business model next to the existing one. David again. You know, you're only allowed 5 questions per TNC, right? Oh, thank you, Mandeep, for reminding me.
Okay, so there's a bit of competition here. We have service providers who get exactly the same kind of information, in effect being a student validation service that can be used to get student reduction
Via SAML,
for
you mean?
free.
Via SAML, you mean?
Via SAML, yes.
So how is doing SAML for free?
What?
How is doing SAML for free? Oh, Leif wants to answer this question.
So my question is...
Yeah, so here's the thing, right, David? When you do that, you do it for free because, and you get away with, well, sort of, they don't pay you because you're one fairly small set of users, right? It's a different story when you're big. This is, as Neil says, 100% of a numbers game, right? There's numbers, there's strength in numbers, right? The only other federation I suspect that could get away with doing what we do is in common, maybe UK Federation. That's because of the size of the combined size of the market here, right? That's what we're trying to do, right? We're trying to build a big enough combined market so that the one attribute that we have that is really valuable, that we produce, that we source, the affiliation attributes, that's the one thing we can bargain with, right? That we can actually see if we can spin something out of that.
So that was sort of going to be my answer.
So in the U.S., we have the National Student Clearinghouse. They were established to verify eligibility for student loans for U.S. higher education. They have over 90% participation of schools in the U.S. have uploaded student records to them. This is one of the key pieces of their business model. So they give away services to higher ed, and then they charge companies for just this exact service. Now they provide a little bit more, like they'll say humanities students or that kind of thing. They have a little bit more grant. Yes. So they charge over, I believe, $1 over. I think it's well over $1 per
that's even better.
transaction.
What is the current conversion course?
Yeah, you would be. Yeah, it's a big, it would be a big deal for them. Well, if everybody participated.
In addition to the comment that Leif made, I think, I'm very much aware that there are many service providers in our current federations who are already getting this and are already playing this game, actually. The consideration you could make is, would you rather trust something operated by your fellow NRANs or in a GEAN project, or simply hand that data over to them and hope that they are doing the right thing with that? I think I would prefer the NRAN scenario there. Any other questions? Yes.
Do I understand correctly that the service is targeted to academia? If we have a federation where we have secondary schools as well, would there be a need for some kind of type of IDP?
Would there be sorry, I didn't completely hear the question. Would there be
some kind of types for IDP which are accepted?
Well, if I understand correctly, you're asking, there is a federation which mixes higher education and primary.
Exactly.
Well, I would assume that you are not. No, that may not be a correct assumption. You are apparently also asserting student for your K-12 or your primary schools as an affiliation. Is that the case?
Exactly.
Aha. Okay. Well, recently a group of people discussed a solution for that problem.
Yeah, I actually remember that one.
Yes.
But,
well,
do you?
It was discussed in the REFETS group Sunday that, and that is not completely sort of, what is it called in English? Well, it was on purpose. Leif and I wrote an entity category definition which basically says this is an IDP that is in academia, academic, sorry, let's not mix up things. And I think your primary school would not fit that criterion. And I think, given on what you've just described, but also, for example, the fact that we have some federations where, for example, commercial guest IDPs are allowed in and be a member of the federation, we would probably want this entity category fairly soon as a service, maybe already at production time.
Okay, that's what I wanted to know.
Yeah.
I suggest that further questions are directed to Niels after this session, because to finish on time, I say we stop here. And before we actually stop, thank you again, Niels. So that was it. That was the session about access control. I hope to see you again tomorrow, as mentioned, at 11 o'clock in the consent session. And as also mentioned, at 6 o'clock in room C, there is the Shibboleth roadmap and update event that you might be interested in. And yeah, that was it. Thank you very much.